Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today, we're going to start a new Little Blue book, and it is Little Blue Book number 19. There, I'll pull back a little bit. And it is titled Nietzsche, Who He Was and What He Stood For, written by Will Durant, Ph.D. Now, I have two different versions of this book number 19, one written by Will Durant and one written by somebody else. Both different, but both on the same subject. This is the one I chose to read because it's the one in the worst shape. As you can see, it's been taped up already. But this one is copyright 1924. So for being 99 years old, this book's in fairly decent shape. But as I open the pages, they tend to break from the spine, so not the best of shape, but we'll try to do it. Okay, so here we go. Let's get some hydration, get rid of that cotton mouth, and then let's do something to increase the cotton mouth. Because that's what we do. All right, now here we go. Nietzsche, Who He Was and What He Stood For, Chapter 1, The Lineage of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the child of Darwin and the brother of Bismarck. It does not matter that he ridiculed the English evolutionist and the German nationalist. He was accustomed to denounce those who had most influenced him. It was his unconscious way of covering up his debts. The ethical philosophy of Spencer was not the most natural corollary of the theory of evolution. If life is a struggle for existence in which the fittest survive, then strength is the ultimate virtue. The weakness, the only fault. Good is that which survives, which wins. Bad is that which gives way and fails. Only the mid-Victorian cowardice of the English Darwinians and the bourgeoisies, respectively of French positivists and German socialists, could conceal the inevitableness of this conclusion. These men were brave enough to reject Christian theology, but they did not dare to be logical, to reject the moral ideas, the worship of meekness and gentleness and altruism, which had grown out of that theology. They remained Anglicans, or Catholics, or Lutherans, long after they had ceased to be Christians. So argued Friedrich Nietzsche. The secret stimulus of the French freethinkers from Voltaire to Auguste Comte was not to remain behind the Christian ideal, but to outbid it if possible. Comte, with his live for others, out-Christianizes Christianity. In Germany, it was Schopenhauer, and in England, John Stuart Mill, who gave the greatest fame to the theory of sympathetic affections, of pity, and of usefulness to others as the principle of action. All the systems of socialism placed themselves unwittingly upon common ground of these doctrines. Darwin unconsciously completed the work of the encyclopedist. They had removed the theological basis of modern morals, but they had left that morality itself touched and inviolate, hanging miraculously in the air. A little breath of biology was all that was needed to clear away the remnant of imposture. Men who could think clearly soon perceived what the profoundest minds of every age had known, that in this battle we call life, what we need is not goodness, but strength, not humility, but pride, not altruism, but resolute intelligence, that equality and democracy are against the grain of selection and survival, that not masses, but geniuses are the goal of evolution, and that not justice, but power is the arbiter of all differences and all destinies. So argued Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, if all this should be true, nothing could be more magnificent or significant than Bismarck. Here was a man who knew the realities of life. He said bluntly that there is no altruism among nations. and that modern issues are to be decided by vote, not by votes and rhetoric, but by blood and iron. What a cleansing whirlwind he was for a Europe rotten with delusions and democracy and ideals. In a few brief months, he had brought decadent Austria to accept his leadership. In a few brief months, he had humbled a France drunk with the legend of Napoleon. And in those brief months, had he not also forced all those little German states, all those petty potentates, principalities, and powers, to fuse themselves into a mighty empire, the very symbol of the new morality of strength. The growing military and industrial vigor of this new Germany needed a voice. The arraignment of war needed a philosophy to justify it. Christianity would not justify it, but Darwinism could. Given a little audacity, and the thing could be done. Nietzsche had the audacity and became the voice. Chapter 2. Youth. Cottonmouth. Remedy. Okay, Chapter 2. Youth. Nevertheless, his father was a minister. A long line of clergymen lay behind each of his parents, and he himself remained a preacher to the end. He attacked Christianity because there was so much of its moral spirit in him. His philosophy was an attempt to balance and correct, by violent contradiction, an irresistible tendency to gentleness and kindness and peace. Was it not the final insult that the good people of Genoa should call him Il Santo, the saint? His mother was a pious and Puritan lady of the same sort that had fostered Immanuel Kant, and with perhaps one disastrous exception. Nietzsche remained pious and Puritan, chaste as a statue to the last. Therefore his assault on Puritanism and piety, how he longed to be a sinner, this incorrigible saint. He was born at Rocken, Prussia, on October 15, 1844, which happened to be the birthday of the reigning Prussian king, Frederick Wilhelm IV. His father, who had tutored several members of the royal family, rejoiced at this patriotic coincidence and named the boy after the king. There was at all events one advantage in the choice of this day for my birth. My birthday, throughout the whole of my childhood, was a day of public rejoicing. The early death of his father left him a victim to the holy woman of the household, who petted him into an almost feminine delicacy and sensibility. He disliked the bad boys of the neighborhood, who robbed birds' nests, raided orchards, played soldier, and told lies. His schoolmates called him the little minister, and one of them described him as a Jesus in the temple. It was his delight to seclude himself and read the Bible, or to read it to others so feelingly as to bring tears to their eyes. But there was a hidden nervous stoicism and pride in him. When his schoolfellows doubted the story of Mutius Scaevola, he ignited a batch of matches in the palm of his hand and let them lie there till they were burnt out. It was a typical incident. All his life long he was to seek physical and intellectual means of hardening himself into an idealized masculinity. What I am not, that for me is God and virtue. At 18, he lost his faith in the God of his fathers and spent the remainder of his life looking for a new deity. He thought he found one in the Superman. He said later that he had taken the change easily, but he had a habit of easily deceiving himself, and is an unreliable autobiographer. He became cynical, like one who had staked all on a single throw of the dice and had lost. Religion had been the very marrow of his life, and now life seemed empty and meaningless. He passed suddenly into a period of sensual riot with his college mates at Bonn and Leipzig, and even overcame the fastidiousness that had made so difficult for him the male arts of smoking and drinking. But soon wine, women, and tobacco disgusted him. He reacted into a great scorn of the whole it's a German word. I'm not even going to attempt that. Of his country and his time. People who drank beer and smoked pipes were incapable of clear perception or subtle thought. It was about this time, in 1865, that he discovered Schopenhauer's World as Will and Idea, and found in it a mirror in which I espied the world life. A mirror in which I espied the world, life, and my own nature depicted with frightful grandeur. Quoting Nietzsche. He took the book to his lodgings and read every word of it hungrily. It seemed as if Schopenhauer were addressing me personally. I felt his enthusiasm and seemed to see him before me. Every line cried aloud for renunciation, denial, resignation. The dark color of Schopenhauer's philosophy impressed itself permanently upon his thoughts, and not only when he was a devout follower of Schopenhauer as educator, the title of one of his essays. Even when he came to denounce pessimism as a form of decadence, he remained at bottom an unhappy man whose nervous system seemed to have been carefully designed for suffering, and whose exaltation of tragedy as the joy of life was but another self-deception. Only Spinoza or Goethe could have saved him from Schopenhauer. But though he preached Aquamintus, and Amor Fati, he never practiced them. The serenity of the sage and the calm of the balanced mind were never his. At the age of 23, he was conscripted into military service. He would have been glad to get exemption as nearsighted and the only son of a widow, but the army claimed him nevertheless. Even philosophers were welcomed as cannon fodder in the great days of Sadowa and Sedan. But a fall from a horse so wretched his breast muscles, that the recruiting sergeant was forced to yield up his prey. Nietzsche never quite recovered from that hurt. His military experience was so brief that he left the army with almost as many delusions about soldiers as he had on entering it. The hard Spartan life of commanding and obeying, of endurance and discipline, appealed to his imagination, now that he was free from the necessity of realizing this ideal himself. He came to worship the soldier because his health would not permit him to become one. From military life he passed to its anecdotes, the academic life of a philologist. Instead of becoming a warrior, he became a Ph.D. At 25, he was appointed to the chair of classical philology, at the University of Basel, from whose safe distance he could admire the bloody ironies of Bismarck. He had queer regrets on talking up this unheroically sedentary work. On the one hand, he wished he had gone into a practical and active profession such as medicine, and at the same time he found himself drawn towards music. He had become something of a pianist, and had written sonatas. Without music, he said, life would be a mistake. And he's right. Not far from Basel was Triebekchen, where the giant of music Richard Wagner was living, with another man's wife. Nietzsche was invited to come and spend his Christmas there in 1869. He was a warm enthusiast for the music of the future, and Wagner did not despise recruits who could lend to his cause something of the prestige that goes with scholarship in universities. Under the spell of the great composer, Nietzsche began to write his first book, which was to begin with the Greek drama and end with the Ring of the Nibelungs. Nibelungs, Nibelungs, Nibelungs. Nieblings, that'd be a long I. No, Nibelungs, never mind. Preaching Wagner to the world as the modern Aeschylus. He went up into the Alps to write in peace, far from the maddening crowd, and there, in 1870, came to him the news that Germany and France had gone to war. He hesitated. The spirit of Greece, and all the muses of poetry and drama and philosophy and music had laid their consecrating hands upon him. But he could not resist the call of his country. Here was poetry, too. Here, he wrote, you have the state of shameful origin. For the greater part of men, a well of suffering that is never dried, a flame that consumes them in its frequent cries. And yet, when it calls, our souls become forgetful of themselves. In its bloody appeal, the multitude is urged to courage and uplifted to heroism. At Frankfurt, on his way to the front, he saw a troop of cavalry passing with magnificent clatter and display through the town. There and then, he says, came the perception, the vision, out of which was to come his entire philosophy. I felt for the first time that the strongest and highest will to life does not find expression in a miserable struggle for existence, but in a will to war, a will to power, a will to overpower. Bad eyesight disqualified him from active soldiering, and he had to be content with nursing. And though he saw horrors enough, he never knew the actual brutality of those battlefields, which his timid soul was later to idealize with all the imaginative intensity of inexperience. Even for nursing, he was too sensitively delicate. The sight of blood made him ill. He fell sick and was sent home in ruins. Ever afterwards, he had the nerves of a Shelley and the stomach of a Carlyle, the soul of a girl under the armor of a warrior. Chapter 3. Nietzsche and Wagner. And as I turn each page, it just cracks and turns brittle along the binding. I'm glad I have several copies of these books. For every time I read one, it damn near ruins it, or it does ruin it. All right, Chapter 3, Nietzsche and Wagner. Early in 1872, he published his first and his only complete book, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. Never had a philologist spoken so lyrically. He told of the two gods whom Greek art had worshipped. At first, Dionysus, or Bacchus, the god of wine and revelry, of ascending life, of joy and action, of ecstatic emotion and inspiration, of instinct and adventure and dauntless suffering, the god of song and music and dance and drama, and then, later, Apollo, the god of peace and leisure and repose, of aesthetic emotion and intellectual contemplation, of logical order and philosophic calm, the god of painting and sculpture and epic poetry. The noblest Greek art was a union of the two ideals, the restless masculine power of Dionysus and the quiet feminine beauty of Apollo. In drama, Dionysus inspired the chorus and Apollo the dialogue. The chorus grew directly out of the procession of the satyr-dressed devotees of Dionysus. The dialogue was an afterthought, a reflective appendage to an emotional experience. The profoundest feature of Greek drama was the Dionysian conquest of Pessimin through art. The Greeks were not the cheerful and optimistic people whom we meet with the modern rhapsodies about them. They knew the stings of life intimately, in its tragic brevity. When Midas asked Silenus, "What fate is best for a man?" Silenus answered, pitiful race of a day, children of accidents and sorrow. Why do you force me to say what were better left unheard? The best of all is unobtainable, not to be born, to be nothing. The second best is to die early. Evidently, these men had little to learn from Schopenhauer or from the Hindus, but the Greeks overcame the gloom of their disillusionment with the brilliance of their art. Out of their own suffering, they made the spectacle of the drama, and found that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon, as an object of artistic contemplation or reconstruction, that existence and the world appear justified. The sublime is the artistic subjugation of the awful. Pessimism is a sign of decay. Optimism is a sign of superficiality. Tragic optimism is the mood of the strong man who seeks intensity and extent of experience, even at the cost of woe, and is delighted to find that strife is the law of life. Tragedy itself is the proof of the fact that the Greeks were not pessimists. The days when this mood begot the Aeschylean it's like Aesop, but it's Aeschylean drama and the pre-Socratic philosophy were the tremendous days of Greece. Socrates, the type of the theological man, was a sign of the loosened fiber of the Greek character. The old Marathonian stalwart capacity of body and soul was more and more sacrificed to the dubious Enlightenment, involving progressive degeneration of the physical and mental powers. Critical philosophy replaced the philosophical poetry of the pre-Socratics. Science replaced art. Intellect replaced instinct. Dialect replaced the games. Under the influence of Socrates, Plato the athlete became an athlete. Plato the dramatist became a logician, an enemy of passion, a deporter of poets, a pre-Christian Christian of epistemologist. On the temple of Apollo at Delphi, those words of passionless wisdom were inscribed, Gothic Sieton and Medan Agan, which became in Socrates and Plato the delusion that intelligence is the only virtue, and in Aristotle the enervating doctrine of the golden mean. In this youth, a people produced poetry and mythology. In its decadence, logic and philosophy. In its youth, Greece produced Homer and Aeschylus. Aeschylus? I don't know. It's just not even worth trying. In the decay, it gave us Euripides, the logician turned dramatist, the rationalist, destroying myth and symbol, the sentimentalist, destroying the tragic optimism of the masculine age, the friend of Socrates who replaces the Dionysian chorus with the Apollonian galaxy of dialecticians. No wonder the Delphic oracle of Apollo had named Socrates the wisest of the Greeks, and Euphrates the wisest after him. And no wonder that the unerring instinct of Aristophanes comprised Socrates and Euphrates, in the same feeling of hatred, and saw in them the symptoms of a degenerate culture. It is true that they recanted that Euphrates' last play, the Bacchic, in his surrender to Dionysus, and the prelude to his suicide, and that Socrates in prison took to practicing the music of Dionysus to ease his conscience. Perhaps thus he had to ask himself, what is not intelligible to me is not therefore unreasonable. Perhaps there is a realm of wisdom from which the logician is banished. Perhaps art is even a necessary correlative of and supplement to science. But it was too late. The work of the logician and the rationalist could not be undone. Greek drama and Greek character decayed. The surprising thing had happened. When the poet and the philosopher recanted, their tendency had already conquered. With them ended the age of heroes and the art of Dionysus. But perhaps the age of Dionysus may return. Did not Kant destroy once and for all the theological reason and the theoretical man? And did not Schopenhauer teach us again the profundity of instinct and the tragedy of thought? And is not Richard Wagner another Aeschylus, restoring myth and symbols, and uniting music and drama again in Dionysian ecstasy? Out of the Dionysian root of the German spirit, a power has risen which has nothing in common with the primitive conditions of Socratic culture, namely German music. In its vast solar orbit from Bach to Beethoven, from Beethoven to Wagner, the German spirit has too long reflected passively the Apollonian art of Italy and France. Let the German people realize that their own instincts are sounder than these decadent cultures. Let them make a reformation in music as in religion, pouring the wild vigor of Luther again into art and life. Who knows but that, out of the war throes of the German nation, another age of heroes dawns, and that out of the spirit of music, tragedy may be reborn. In 1872, Nietzsche returned to Bissau, still weak in body, but with a spirit burning with ambition and loath to consume itself in the drudgery of lecturing. I have before me work enough for 50 years, and I must mark time under the yoke. Already he was a little disillusioned with the war. The German Empire is extirpating the German spirit, he wrote. The victory of 1871 had brought a certain coarse conceit into the soul of Germany, and nothing could be more hostile to spiritual growth. An impish quality in Nietzsche made him restless before every idol, and he determined to assail this dulling complacency by attacking its most respected exponent, David Strauss. I enter society with a duel. Stendhal gave the advice in the second of his well-named Thoughts of the Season, Schopenhauer as educator. He turned his fire upon the chauvinistic universities. Experience teaches us that nothing stands so much in the way of developing great philosophers as the custom of supporting bad ones in state universities. No state would ever dare to patronize such men as Plato and Schopenhauer. The state is always afraid of them. He renewed the attack in The Future of Our Educational Institutions, and in The Use and Abuse of History. He ridiculed the submergence of the German intellect in the minuet of antiquarian scholarship. Already, in these essays, two of his distinctive ideas found expression: that morality as well as theology must be reconstructed in terms of the evolution theory, and that the function of life is to bring about not the betterment of the majority, who, taken as individuals, are the most worthless types, but the creation of genius, the development and elevation of superior personalities. The most enthusiastic of these essays was called Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. It hailed Wagner as a Siegfried who has never learned the meaning of fear, and is founder of the only real art, because the first to fuse all the arts into a great aesthetic synthesis, and it called upon Germany to realize the majestic significance of the coming Wagner festival. Bayreuth signifies for us the morning sacrament on the day of battle. This was the voice of youthful worship, the voice of an almost femininely refined spirit, who saw in Wagner something of that masculine decisiveness and courage which went later into the conception of the Superman. But the worshipper was a philosopher too, and recognized in Wagner a certain dictatorial egotism offensive to an aristocratic soul. He could not bear Wagner's attack upon the French in 1871, though Paris had not been kind to Tannenhauser, and he was astonished at Wagner's jealousy of Brahms. And the central theme even of this laudatory essay boded no good for Wagner. The world has been orientalized long enough, and men now yearn to be Hellenized. But Nietzsche already knew that Wagner was half Semitic. And where are we? We're at 30 minutes. I think we'll stop there. Yep, that's where we'll stop. That brings us to the conclusion of part 1 of Little Blue Book number 19, Nietzsche, who he was and what he stood for. Boop, as the cover has already fallen off. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.